So today we're going to be talking about, or this week really, we're going to be talking about Gender, Transgression, and Villainy in animated film by Meredith Lee Vollmer and Mark E. LaPointe, or LaPointe, I don't know. So this is from 2003, so like a lot of the stuff that we're reading, it's not like, it's like an old piece of theory, but I like doing that because I think it gives us the opportunity to look at how things have changed and like how movies, since the movies cited in these works, have changed. So I think that makes sense. Alright, so I do understand that this is like a pretty difficult read, which is true of a lot of the stuff in this unit. Probably wouldn't have assigned this unit exactly as is if I had known that the last half of the semester was going to be online, but here we are, doing our best. So we're going to talk about this. So in this article, as you can see from the abstract, they are basically going to be looking at the ways in which gender transgression is used as an indicator of deviance and villainy. So to understand this article, you have to know what transgression means, and you have to know what it means to be deviant. So a transgression is just any act that goes against a law, a code of conduct. Really, any time that you cross the boundaries of what society deems as good and normal, you are transgressing. And to transgress could make you a deviant. So deviant means something that is departing from usual or accepted standards, especially in social or sexual behavior. And so as we'll see, Disney uses specific markers to show who's evil and who's good. And if you notice in the exercise that I gave you guys, like the activity where you are looking at villains and heroes, most of you, whether you've seen the movies or not, you can probably pick out who's good and who's bad. And in a lot of ways, I think we can take for granted that that is, obvious. And I don't think that's something we should take for granted, right? I actually think there's, a lot to be learned from what we as a society deem an evil appearance or, a good appearance. So, according to these authors, an evil appearance is one in which gender norms are transgressed, and a good appearance is one in which gender norms are lived up to very effectively. So you will see with all of the princesses, they look like the perfect woman according to the societal standards of the time. So they usually have a very feminine figure, feminine facial features. They don't look like they're wearing that much makeup, so their beauty is natural. They're very naturally feminine, whereas if you look at someone like Cruella de Vil, she wears a lot of makeup, implying that her femininity is not natural. So that's kind of what these authors are looking at. So they're essentially saying that Disney has created, or animators in general, they don't just look at Disney, has created a villain as sissy archetype that signifies villains as deviant and enhances the positive gender qualities of heroes. And this study also discusses the potential impact this pattern of representation may have in terms of limiting and reinforcing heteronormative gender roles and promoting negative associations about gays. So that is a quote from the abstract. That is what the authors tell us they're going to do. So heteronormative gender roles is just gender roles that live up to the idea of ideal heterosexuality, right? So the woman is nurturing, she probably stays home, or maybe she has a job like a nurse or a teacher. The man would be powerful, he could rescue her like a prince, So heteronormativity is just anything that deems heterosexuality as the natural, correct order of things. And these authors are challenging that because they say that for children who are not heterosexual or who will not grow up to be heterosexual, it's a problem to tell them that gayness is synonymous with evil. So This kind of follows up from what we talked about last week with Ursula. So Ursula is kind of her femininity is like a little deviant, right? She's not, she doesn't live up to like feminine ideals. And as this article actually tells us, I'm pretty sure this is in this article, but if not, I assure you it is true. Ursula was actually based on the drag queen Divine, like when they were doing her character. So she is actually supposed to emulate a drag queen. And Divine was in a lot of like John Waters movies. You can look Divine up if you want. Okay. So we begin this article with a quote from The Celluloid Closet by Vito Russo. So there's a lot of like other sources used here, and I think that when you're looking at these academic articles, they can provide a pretty good example of how outside sources need to be incorporated. Many of you are having a huge problem with that in the music video, or the song analyses. I'm seeing a lot of you really just listing like what Genius had to say in a way that's not like effective. Like I can just go to Genius and read that, you know? So if you feel like you need a model in the next essay for how to incorporate sources, these articles are doing it well. They're taking the thoughts of other people in the field and they're applying them to their ideas, and they're expanding their ideas, which is what I want you doing in the Jumble Entry Journal too. So this is from The Celluloid Closet. After all, it is supposed to be an insult to call a man a feminist, for it means he is like a woman and therefore not as valuable as a real man. The popular definition of gayness is rooted in sexism. Weakness in men rather than strength in women has consistently been seen as the connection between sex role behavior and deviant sexuality. So this is still on the first page. And so right away they're making this claim that I think is really like central to this argument and really interesting as well, that homophobia, although these authors are using the term homonegativism, and they have a footnote about why they decided to use that as their term, but they do essentially mean homophobia the way that we usually say it. Homophobia does not necessarily come from an innate hatred of gayness so much as it is from misogyny. So femininity in a man is a problem in our society, and I think in a lot of ways you can still kind of see that, right? Like, I think it's still much more societally acceptable for a woman to wear pants than it is for a man to wear a dress, or, like, I don't know, I mean, that's, maybe makeup would be another example, and it is becoming much more accepted, which is a good thing, but historically, it's always been more acceptable for women to be more masculine than it is for men to be more feminine. And that's, you know, I mean, there's a million ways that that plays out, and like, you know, whatever, we don't have time, I guess, to examine that. You could really teach a whole class on that itself, but I'm sure you guys can think of examples, and you can talk about that in the discussion forum as well. All right, so that is what they're saying about homophobia, right? So they're making that claim. And then they also set out the claim that movies are important. So you'll notice these articles always do this, right? Like, I already have said to you, movies are important, and we have like talked about it in class in a way that I hope has established for everyone in class so far that like movies matter, right? The stuff we show our kids actually does inform the way they see the world, and it does matter. Like, media is entertainment, but it's not meaningless. So they make that claim, and they say here that, this is on the second page, or I think it's page 90, that film and TV do not only reflect reality, they also shape reality by teaching children what is right and what is wrong, and even giving them subliminal messages about that, right? Or messages that maybe aren't even just subliminal, but you know, by showing evil as somewhat gay, using this villainous sissy archetype, they are teaching children that they should adhere to their assigned gender role. All right. Then we have this section titled Literature Review. So when authors are doing a literature review, it just means that they're going to tell you about some other articles and books that have informed what they're about to say. So they're like reviewing the literature of like queer theory that has come before. And also as a side note, like generally in academia, this is what it's called when you're studying like LGBT stuff in movies, books, etc. Is called queer theory. That is occasionally somewhat controversial because the word queer began as a slur and is still often used as a slur today. But I'm going to continue using it because I think it has a very well-established history in academia as the term that we use to discuss this kind of stuff. It's also like an umbrella term that has been able to adopt like various identities over time. So these authors, for example, are not mentioning like asexuality or like people who are intersex as part of the umbrella of like queerness that they're talking about. But when we use the word queer theory, we are able to, bring those terms in later, like as, I guess as like queer theory expands and as this umbrella of identities expands and becomes like more widely accepted. So, and these authors also like sort of make their case for why they use the word queer. But I will just like preface that with saying, don't call people queer if you're not queer. Like you shouldn't say that. Still a slur. Okay. So they talk a bit about gender performance, which I think is really like important and interesting. So this is on page 91. They talk about Judith Butler, who is one of like the most important queer theorists of all time. She wrote the book Gender Trouble, and her idea was basically that like gender is a performance. Gender is not innate. It is not something that you are like born with, right? Like women aren't born like wanting to wear pink and like put on makeup, right? These are all things that we perform later in life to say to people, hey, this is my gender, right? So this is on page 91. Judith Butler said, I'm quoting, "There is no gender identity behind the expressions of gender. Identity is performatively constituted by the very expressions that are said to be its results." So there's a lot to sort of unpack there. But basically what Butler is saying is that there's a misconception that the expression of gender is different than gender. And I always like can't paraphrase this very well, so pardon me if I'm more confusing than Butler is, but like she's essentially saying like I identify as a woman, right? So I have like long hair and my nails are painted right now and I'm wearing earrings and I'm wearing lipstick, I'm wearing rings, and I gesture a lot with my hands, I kind of uptalk. So all of these things are generally associated with like femininity, and they all mark me as a woman. And Butler is saying that that is the identity, right? Like there's nothing innately feminine about earrings or lipstick. That's just like societal stuff that we do to express our gender. So she's basically saying that there is no gender identity behind the expressions of gender. So we are always expressing our gender, and that is how identity itself is constituted. So gender identity can be like fluid in that understanding, and it's something that we do every single day. So there's like a very famous quote from, God, I forgot what this movie is called now. It's like Out something. I'll look it up, sorry. a lot of people think RuPaul said this. RuPaul did not say this. RuPaul did not invent this quote. But this is from like a really old documentary about being gay from like the 80s, 70s. It's pretty old. But one of the people in that documentary says, you're born naked, all the rest is drag. Essentially meaning like you're born naked, everything else you do from that point onward is your construction of your gender identity at that moment and like how you feel. So it's kind of like a complicated concept, but I'm sure you can like think about what you wore the last time you went out in public, which might have been a month ago or 2 weeks ago or whatever, and might have been recently if you have like an essential job. But I'm sure you can think of like things about yourself that are performing your gender in some way or not performing your gender, right? So like when I was in high school, it was like a thing for dudes to have long hair and like, I don't know, like look like sort of skaterish in that way, and like older teachers who were rude, honestly. I don't know why. It's so weird to me that teachers would like comment on what their students appearance, like in a negative way. It's so mean. But teachers would always say to them like, oh, like you look like a girl, like cut your hair, stuff like that. So if you're a guy and you have long hair, you might be like that would be like challenging normal ideas of masculinity and expanding them, right? So like when Kanye wears a dress, he's saying like men can do this too, right? He's not saying like I am more feminine. He's saying that like gender is kind of it's an umbrella that can include a lot of different types of expression. I'm not sure if this is making a ton of sense, but hopefully you're kind of getting it. So you can think about the ways in which you express your own gender. And so Butler goes on to say, quote, certain iterations of gender have seized a hegemonic place in dominant discourse and have come to appear as natural or essential. Okay, so a lot of like words there. Hegemonic just means like powerful or dominant. Iterations of gender just means like types of gender expression. And dominant discourse would just be like society, like the way that we all discuss gender. So some of the iterations of gender that have seized a hegemonic place in dominant discourse and have come to appear as natural or essential might be something like, you know, boys wear blue when they're babies and girls wear pink, right? Like that's a hegemonic idea about gender. And there's nothing essential about that, right? Like you're not born, like I said, liking pink because of like your genitals, right? Okay. So I hope that was not too confusing. All right. So on the next page, the authors discuss why they use the word queer. They say, we see queer as a powerful term that encompasses broad notions of that which is other than or beyond normal, as well as narrower understandings of individuals and images that can be identified as gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, or transsexual. For the purposes of our work here, we purposefully maintain these multiple meanings and examine representations of villainy as both deviant and as homosexual. In other words, through both a broad and a narrow understanding of queer. Used thus, queer represents a moment of fissure when that which is normal is thrown into question, a space through which the researcher can locate and relay evidence that problematizes the relation between the normal and the natural. So that is, again, like a lot. But the authors are essentially saying that they like the word queer not only because it is like this all-encompassing term for like LGBTQ+, but also because queerness for them represents a broader type of media in which they can just kind of look at the ways that normalcy is thrown into question. So what is natural versus what is considered normal? Is it natural for women to like wear, or I don't know, pretend it's like the like 1800s? Is it natural for women to have to wear corsets and giant skirts all the time? Or was it just considered normal by society? So that's kind of like what they're saying. So you can kind of read through that a bit more if you want to fully understand what they have to say about, like, the term. All right, and then they say that children learn about gender norms from movies and from TV. And we've really gone over this in a lot of different ways, right? Like, TV and movies teach children about race, they teach children about gender, they teach children about sexuality. So all of these things are kind of coming together as we move through the unit. All right. Disney does gender. I'm on page 94 now. All right, so they mention that Disney, I believe they use the term the presumptive nature of heterosexuality, and I also don't have a printer, so I just have to do this off of my computer, so I don't really have my marked up copy with notes, so I'm sorry about that. But the presumptive nature of heterosexuality essentially just means that children's films show straightness as normal. It is normal to be heterosexual, and it is good to be normal, according to these movies. That's kind of what they're showing. So then if you go down, they give us this analysis of all the different ways that animated villains are shown as queer, or what they call the villain as sissy archetype. And it is also probably worth noting that the background of Disney switching all its villains to be men, or switching a lot of its villains to be men, is that they got in trouble for, or not in trouble, but a lot of theorists said it was a problem that all of the villains were women. So if you look at really old Disney, Cinderella, the evil stepmother is a woman. 101 Dalmatians, Cruella de Vil is a woman. Snow White, the queen, I don't know her name, she's a woman. Sleeping Beauty, Maleficent is a woman. And all of those women also, they also transgress gender in the opposite way, right? So they are, I think, they are generally seen as more masculine, they are less stereotypically beautiful. Cinderella's stepsisters were very explicitly considered ugly. Cruella de Vil, again, has to wear a lot of makeup in this way that kind of is reminiscent of a drag queen. Same with Ursula, kind of a throwback villain in that way. Yeah, so these authors are examining the way that male villains, which Disney started doing male villains because they were like, okay, sorry, we're not going to have women as evil all the time. Men can be evil too. But unfortunately, in most Disney movies, up until 2003 at least, male villains were marked as villainous by the ways in which they were feminine. So we are going to look at all of these different things. So page, let's see. Alright, so on page 98 we have sort of these physical features. So on their faces, some things that are mentioned are feminine facial features, like arched brows, eyelids that are darkened, as is with makeup. They often have narrower faces, where the heroes will often have a pretty chiseled jaw. Their costumes, many of the male villains that you'll see will be wearing something reminiscent of a gown. Governor Ratcliffe is wearing high heels. They'll also often be wearing more feminine colors, like purple or pink or something. Hades also wears a gown, basically. Their gestures and posture, these authors say that they often have repressed or controlled posture in a way that is reminiscent of a prim or proper woman, and the one place where they do gesture a lot is with their hands, right? So this is a very old stereotype about gay men of the sort of hand thing. Excessive hand gesturing. They'll also cross their legs. They will have hips that they kind of sway their hips a lot. In their activities, they're often very passive. They're very vain. They'll usually be surrounded by a lot of luxury, So this is definitely true for Jafar, definitely true for Governor Ratcliffe. I think it's true for Hades. I think there's like a scene where Hades is kind of like fixing his hair and seeing how he looks. So vanity is, I think we can probably all agree, not associated with masculinity quite as much as it is associated with femininity. Like, usually women are the ones who are expected to be thinking a lot about their appearance, whereas men are supposed to be out, like, doing, I don't know, whatever it is John Smith does out there in the wilderness in Pocahontas, right? Like, cutting down trees, etc. I think Mulan is a good example of this, too. If anyone's ever seen Mulan, like, we get a really clear sense of what masculine and feminine are supposed to be in the songs We Are Men versus the song where Mulan is getting all like dressed up to be displayed and chosen as a wife. So like the only way that Mulan can bring honor to her family is by finding a good husband who wants to marry her, and the way that these men can achieve honor in the military is by what do they do? They cross a cold river, they're like lifting a lot of stuff, they have to be swift as a racing river, with all the strength of a great typhoon. Something mysterious is the dark side of the moon. We are men. I hope you guys know that song, but if you don't, those are the lyrics. I didn't just make that up. So a real man is active, right? He's helping with the war effort. He's doing something. Whereas the male villains often have like henchmen to do that stuff for them, and they themselves are kind of like sitting around in luxury, chilling, being lazy. Their speech is also very much reflective of this kind of underlying characterization as feminine and thus not heterosexual. So, for example, there's a moment in The Lion King that's mentioned here when Scar meets Simba for the first time, and Mufasa says, like, that little hairball is my son and your future king, and Scar says, oh, let me practice my curtsy. And Scar also does a lot of, like, gesturing like this. He often sits with his paws crossed that way. He has a much more flowing mane than Mufasa does. So even though they're lions, they're still kind of, the animators are still able to make these things come through. And I thought one of the most revealing pieces of dialogue was actually, I think it's also from The Lion King, and they're talking about I don't know my ability to underline this here. I think they're talking about Scar, though, but the bird Zazu says of Scar, there's one in every family, which I think is pretty clearly, like, coded to be kind of a joke about, like, oh, there's someone gay in every family, someone who's, like, they're not normal in this way. And so, by coding all of these villains as gay, Disney is essentially showing that gayness and queerness generally are a problem, right? And what I mean when I say coding, like C-O-D-E, code, that just means that basically, like, they are, like, the animators are using a lot of signals, like the stuff that I just went through, to show us that they are effeminate, that they are supposed to make us think of them as not real men or something, but it's never explicitly stated, like, oh, this person's gay, right? Like, they don't have same-sex relationships. They just live up to a lot of stereotypes about gayness that come from like a homophobic patriarchal society. And so the problem with that is, well, according to these authors, obviously, the problem with that is that children learn a lot about their gender and sex roles from movies, right? Like, you learn how to be a real man or like a real woman from these animated movies, and if you're learning that being effeminate makes you evil, then you're obviously going to have a harder time if you're a boy who does not actually want to engage in like standard, normalized, heterosexual gender presentation, right? And the other thing that I think is interesting to kind of note here is that there is one movie, at least, that really, really breaks out of this paradigm. So as I've told you, like, when people write criticism about Disney movies, Disney usually listens, you know, like they got criticized a lot for having all of these like gay-seeming villains. And so then the movie that I think really shifted that was Frozen. Because in Frozen we have this like very you know, stereotypically good-looking, masculine, like charming, whatever type of dude, and he like sweeps the princess off her feet and they fall in love. And the reason that was so effective is that Disney has trained their viewers so well to equate masculinity and handsomeness and all of that with goodness, that as viewers, most people were pretty surprised when he turned out to be as evil as he actually was, because he looked the part of the hero. So I guess that is, to me, like pretty effective proof that we are absolutely like taught from a young age to see very masculine cartoon men as being good and very feminine cartoon women as being good, and we are taught to see animated characters who transgress their assigned gender role in some way as evil. So like Ursula, Cruella de Vil, all of these people who are mentioned in this article, etc. So I hope that kind of helps you like understand what's being said here. Yeah, so there is a discussion up for you guys, and there's also an activity where I want you to pick one hero and one villain of the people listed. Ideally, maybe don't choose ones that everyone else has chosen, right? Like, try to choose something different so we have a good variety. And I would like you to use this article as a lens through which you look to see how the villains are transgressing their gender roles and how the heroes are living up to their gender roles. So you'll need to look more closely at the sections labeled like, you know, dialogue, activities, nonverbal gestures and body position, costuming and props, all of that. You'll need to look more closely at those things for some of the ways that these authors see animators as using stereotypes to make animated characters look evil through their gender presentation. Okay. So I think that's it. I hope you guys are all doing well, staying safe, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.